The dense forest stood still beneath the soft gray sky, a vast canopy of ancient trees stretching for miles. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, the quiet murmurs of the natural world barely perceptible in the pre-dawn stillness. Here, deep within the sanctuary, the wilderness held its secrets, ancient and untold, known only to those who could listen, truly listen. Miles away from the nearest town, the sanctuary was isolated. It had been established as a haven for endangered species, a place where wildlife could roam freely, untouched by human encroachment. A small, rustic cabin stood near the edge of a dense grove, where the forest met a wide, sluggish river. This cabin was where Henry had lived for the last 5 years, a caretaker of the land and the animals within it. Henry had always been a quiet man, a man more attuned to the sound of rustling leaves than the chatter of humans. His life had become a solitary rhythm, each day blending into the next. But in the past few weeks, something had changed. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the corners of his vision, a strange unease that followed him during his morning rounds. He told himself it was nothing, a natural feeling when you lived alone in such a remote place. But then, the crows began. It started one morning about a week ago when Henry first noticed them. Crows, hundreds of them. They appeared before sunrise, gathering in the trees along the riverbank, their black silhouettes stark against the pale blue sky. It was an unsettling sight, their beady eyes watching with a kind of patient intelligence. They didn't make the usual raucous noise that crows were known for. Instead, they sat in silence, like sentinels, their eyes trained on the cabin and the surrounding forest. Each morning they were there. He couldn't explain why, but the sight of them made his skin crawl, the way they perched, motionless, as if waiting for something. And yet, every time he went to investigate, they would take off, their wings beating as one in a flurry of black feathers vanishing into the sky. One morning, Henry rose earlier than usual, his senses sharpened by a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had been unable to sleep the night before, the sounds of the crow's quiet presence lingering in his mind. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, staring into the gray light of dawn. The crows were already there, more numerous than ever, their dark shapes scattered across the trees like ominous shadows. He decided to take a walk down to the river. The forest was still asleep, the only sound being the crunch of his boots against the frost-covered ground. The chill in the air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the birds, and a strange sense of dread crept over him. As he neared the riverbank, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The crows were no longer perched in the trees. They were gathered in a tight cluster on the ground near the water's edge. They circled something. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped closer. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, and the crows lifted as one, their wings beating violently in unison, sending a cloud of dark feathers into the sky. The clearing was now empty. Henry stood frozen, staring at the place where they had been. There was nothing on the ground, no sign of what they had been gathered around. His mind raced, and his heart began to pound in his chest. It didn't make sense. Crows didn't gather for no reason. They never did. He slowly made his way back to the cabin, his mind tangled in a web of confusion and fear. The thought that had been gnawing at him for days now began to settle into his gut like a lead weight. The crows were trying to tell him something. That night, sleep didn't come. The air outside the cabin was still, and the stars above twinkled in silence. The darkness outside felt heavier than usual, as if something were watching. And then, from the forest came a sound, a soft, distant rustling. Henry listened carefully. It wasn't the usual nocturnal rustle of the trees or the subtle movements of nocturnal creatures. This sound was different. It was deliberate. It was like something, or someone, was moving through the woods, just beyond his sight. The rustling grew louder, closer. He grabbed the lantern from the table and slowly crept outside. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. His breath quickened as he stepped further into the darkness. The crows. He could hear them again, calling from the trees, but this time their voices were filled with an unnatural urgency. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. A shadow, fleeting and quick, darted through the trees. Henry froze. His pulse raced as his instincts told him to run, to get inside, but he couldn't move. The shadow passed through the clearing, and as it did, the crows fell silent. It was as if they had all stopped to watch, waiting for something. The shadow shifted again, and Henry's eyes went wide. In the moonlight, the shape became clearer. A figure, draped in dark robes, slowly emerged from the woods. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Henry's mind reeled. He turned to flee, but the moment his feet moved, a loud, shrill scream shattered the night air, a sound that echoed through the trees like a primal warning. The crows exploded from the treetops in a chaotic frenzy, their wings flapping wildly, their calls deafening. They swept across the clearing, enveloping Henry in a dark, suffocating cloud. His heart pounded in his chest, and he stumbled backward, desperate to escape the barrage of birds. And then, as quickly as it began, the noise stopped. The forest fell still once more. Henry stood in the center of the clearing, his body trembling, his mind reeling. The crows had vanished, and in their place stood the figure. The figure, now clearer in the moonlight, was no longer a shadow, but a man. A man dressed in tattered clothing, his face obscured by a hood. The figure reached down and, with deliberate slowness, pulled something from the ground. It was a book, old and weathered, its pages yellowed with age. The man turned toward Henry, his movements slow and calculated. Without saying a word, the man began to walk away, the book in hand. The crows, once again silent, followed him, their wings beating in time with his steps. Henry stood motionless, watching the procession fade into the distance. It wasn't until the last crow disappeared into the trees that he realized what had happened. The crows hadn't been watching him, they had been watching the man. And now, Henry knew, he wasn't the one they had been waiting for. The sanctuary, once a place of peace, now felt haunted. He was no longer alone. The forest was full of secrets, and the crows had been its keepers all along. The stillness of the forest weighed heavily on Henry. The air felt thicker now, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath. The man, if that's what he truly was, had vanished into the depths of the trees, leaving only the sound of his footsteps to linger in the silence. Henry's legs trembled, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth as he stood frozen in place. The lantern in his hand flickered, casting strange shadows that danced around him, mocking his stillness. He wanted to run, to retreat to the safety of the cabin, but his body wouldn't obey. His eyes were locked on the shadows, on the spot where the figure had disappeared, but there was nothing to see now, just the inky blackness of the forest stretching endlessly, like a living entity. The crows were gone, but their presence remained in the air, a kind of invisible weight pressing down on his chest. Henry had spent years in this sanctuary, learning the rhythms of the land, the pulse of the wildlife. He had become attuned to every rustle, every shift of the earth beneath his feet. But tonight, nothing felt right. The forest, once a place of sanctuary, had become something else, something ominous, something beyond his understanding. With every passing second, the dread that had begun to stir in his chest grew stronger. He took a cautious step forward, then another. The lantern's light wavered, its flame struggling against the increasing wind. His feet carried him, almost involuntarily, toward the trees where the figure had disappeared. He was drawn to it, as though some invisible force was pulling him in. His mind was foggy, his thoughts disjointed. All he could think about was the book. The old weathered book the figure had held in his hands. The one that had caught Henry's eye. What was it? Why had the man come for it? And why had the crows followed him so obediently? Henry's steps grew more frantic as he pushed through the underbrush, the forest becoming denser, the trees crowding in around him. The path ahead was barely visible in the dim light, and the oppressive weight of the night air made each breath feel labored. As he moved deeper into the woods, he heard something. A whisper. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, clearer, almost like a voice. No, not a voice, a chant. His heart quickened as he stumbled forward, his feet slipping over the wet ground. He reached a clearing, and there, in the center, the figure stood once more. But now the man wasn't alone. Surrounding him were dozens of crows, perched silently in the trees, their eyes glinting in the darkness. The figure, hood still low over his face, raised the book high above his head, the ancient pages fluttering in the wind. His lips moved, speaking words that Henry couldn't hear, but could somehow feel vibrating through the ground beneath him. The chanting grew louder, an eerie resonance filling the air. It wasn't just sound, it was a sensation, a pressure that pushed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The crows began to stir, their beady eyes flicking toward Henry, who now stood frozen at the edge of the clearing. Their silence was more unnerving than their calls had ever been. And then, with a sudden motion, the figure dropped the book to the ground, the thud echoing through the trees. The crows erupted into motion, their wings beating in unison, as though responding to an unseen command. For a moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The crows flew in a great swirling mass, a dark cloud that enveloped the figure, and Henry, standing at the edge of the clearing, felt a shiver run down his spine. The figure raised his arms as if welcoming them, but the way the crows surrounded him was unnatural, too controlled, too deliberate. The forest, once quiet and peaceful, now felt alive in a way Henry had never experienced before. The trees groaned under the weight of something unseen, the air thick with a sense of impending danger. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The figure, the crows, they weren't part of the natural order. They were something older, something far more ancient than the forest itself. Henry had always believed that the sanctuary was a place where humans and nature coexisted in peace, a refuge for the wildlife that depended on it. But now he realized, with an overwhelming sense of horror, that the sanctuary had been built on something far older, a power long forgotten, hidden beneath the earth. He took a step forward, compelled by a force he couldn't explain, when suddenly the crows scattered. The figure's hooded face turned toward Henry, and for the first time Henry saw his eyes. They were not human, they were something else. Deep, endless black pools staring right through him, seeing into him. The man's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was knowing, sinister. Then, without warning, the crows surged forward again, a wave of black feathers. Henry instinctively stepped back, but the birds were too fast. The first one struck him with such force that he staggered, and then another. His heart pounded as the crows surrounded him, their beaks jabbing at him, pulling at his clothes, their wings flapping in a deafening crescendo. The chanting from the figure intensified, filling Henry's head with an overwhelming pressure, drowning out everything else. In a blind panic, Henry shoved his way through the cloud of crows, his arms flailing, his feet tangling in the underbrush. The birds followed, relentless, their caws echoing in his ears. His mind was in chaos, but the one thing that burned through the frenzy was a single thought. He had to escape. He ran. The forest became a blur, the trees rushing past him as he pushed forward, the crows still hot on his heels. His legs ached, his lungs burned with each labored breath, but he didn't dare stop. The sounds of the birds seemed to surround him, pressing in from all sides. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, He broke through the trees, stumbling into the open field near the cabin. The crows abruptly stopped their pursuit, halting just at the edge of the forest. Henry collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his body trembling from the sheer terror of what he had just experienced. Behind him, the forest was silent once more. The figure and the crows had disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. Only the distant sound of the river could be heard, as though nothing had changed. But Henry knew. Something had changed. Something had awakened. As he looked back toward the woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The crows hadn't been watching him. They had been watching the forest. The night had settled around Henry like a heavy cloak, its darkness pressing in from all sides. The once comforting hum of the wilderness now felt like a foreign sound. His heart still raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins, but he forced himself to stand and take slow, measured breaths. His legs wobbled as he rose to his feet, his eyes fixed on the dark edge of the forest where the crows had disappeared into the shadows. The cabin felt like a distant refuge now, its warm walls and familiar comforts a mere illusion of safety. It stood there, silent and still, its silhouette framed by the faint glow of the moon. Henry's thoughts circled back to the unsettling figure, the man who had led the crows. The figure's eyes, those unnatural abyssal black pools, haunted him. He could still feel their cold weight on him, as if the figure was waiting, watching, even now. The forest behind him felt alive, not in the way it had always been, but as something much older, something aware of his presence. He shook his head, trying to push away the irrational thoughts that swirled like a storm in his mind. It was just fear, he told himself, a trick of the mind. The forest didn't change. It was just trees and dirt, roots and... But deep down, Henry knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. He could feel it in the air, thick with an unnatural stillness, the very atmosphere shivering with tension. The crows had returned. He hadn't seen them, but he could hear them. Their calls, faint but growing louder, filled the air like a distant storm brewing. They were circling, higher now, above the treetops, their wings cutting through the sky in tight, precise formations. He turned slowly, the weight of the forest pressing against his back, and looked into the vast stretch of darkness where he had just fled from. The crows, he knew, were watching him again. The sound of their wings grew closer, their calls sharper, more insistent. Henry's breath hitched in his throat, his eyes darting around the clearing. There, at the edge of the woods, he thought he saw a figure moving. No, it wasn't just one figure, but a collection of shapes, faintly illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Shadows that stretched and contorted, blending with the trees. The crows' calls intensified. They were louder now, almost deafening. Henry's legs refused to move. He felt paralyzed, his mind locked in place, a prisoner to the dread that gripped him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the fear that gripped his heart was not just fear of the crows or the figure. It was a deeper, primal fear, something ancient. From within the forest there came a low hum, a sound that wasn't quite audible, but something Henry could feel deep in his chest, vibrating in the air around him. It was a chant, but not like the one the figure had spoken earlier. This one was different. It felt like it was coming from the very ground beneath his feet, from the roots of the trees that spread like veins under the earth. It wasn't just a chant. It was an invocation. The figure's presence loomed closer, not physical, but palpable, like the atmosphere had thickened, a pressure pushing in from all sides. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the crows finally descended from the sky, a dark wave of feathers that swept across the clearing with terrifying precision. The sight was unnerving. Too many birds, their eyes gleaming with something other than instinct. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the birds scattered, vanishing into the trees. Silence. For a moment, Henry didn't dare move, his mind racing with questions he could barely grasp. What was this place? What had he stumbled upon in this sanctuary, this place that had once been his refuge? The crows, the man, the chanting, nothing fit together. None of it made sense. Then the ground shifted beneath him. A tremor, small but undeniable, rippled through the earth, like the land was waking up. Henry felt it in his bones, the ground trembling ever so slightly, and a sense of vertigo swept over him. Something deep within the forest, something buried, was stirring. The lantern in his hand flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the trees. For a brief, terrifying moment, Henry thought he saw something moving at the edge of the woods. A shadow larger than anything a man should cast. He turned, heart hammering in his chest, and made his way toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier, the ground beneath him no longer solid. The sense of being watched was suffocating, and Henry felt eyes on him from every direction.